Dr. Swarna, Dr. Prerna, the statistical experts, Dr. Maninda, Dr. Sabyasachi Sengupta, Dr. Rohit Modi, and the session coordinator, Dr. Parul Deshpande. So I would be discussing my article, the whole presentation would be in two parts. First, we'll be describing the article with respect to the introduction to the topic and the need for the study, followed by methods, results. Discussion would be with respect to other studies reported on the same topic in literature and the author's interpretation, followed by the MARI format, which is the dissection of the article, and we will cover this as I go to those subsequent slides. So coming to the article for the day, this is surgical timing for congenital ptosis should not be determined slowly by the presence of anisometropia, published in the Ophthalmic, Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery, with the impact factor of the journal being 1.134. So as we all know, congenital ptosis is a rare condition characterized by an abnormal drooping of the upper eyelid that is present since birth or occurs within the first year of life, resulting in reduction of the vertical palpebral fissure. The timing of surgery for congenital ptosis is an often debated issue. I have not started the recording, so 1 second.
I have started, don't worry.
Okay, sure, I'm sorry for that, yeah. So the indications for early surgery is obstructed visual axis and a significant chin lift, which can be a relative indication. The later surgery obviously has the advantage that it helps in more accurate assessment of levator function, thus deciding what type of surgery is more suitable for the patient with greater accuracy. Also, there is decreased risk of post-operative exposure keratopathy, as the older children are more cooperative for forceful eyelid closure exercises, and the cornea can be assessed better. And the anesthesia-related complications are relatively lesser in older children. So the question comes, but in many patients, the visual axis is clear, and the determinants of early surgery in these cases is not very certain. So generally, refractive error and isometropy or increasing astigmatism is considered a criterion in the setting of amblyopia for early surgery in these patients. It has been noted that there is a higher prevalence of preoperative astigmatism and corneal irregularities in children with ptosis. But however, lessening of these factors following ptosis surgery has not been convincingly demonstrated. But there are reports in both pediatric and oculoplasty literature which continue to cite anisometropia as an indication for early intervention. So coming to the article for the day, with the objective of the study being to investigate the change in refractive error and amblyopia in children undergoing ptosis surgery to better inform decisions regarding surgical timing. So this was a retrospective chart analysis between the patients that were operated between May 2002 and May 2017 at the Medical College of Wisconsin, the ophthalmology department, and it followed the tenets of Declaration of Helsinki. So all the patients who underwent congenital ptosis during the study period were identified using the various procedural terminology like frontalis sling, external levator advancement, and conjunctiva molar resection, muscle resection. So with this, 184 patients were identified and only 56 were included. That means 128 patients were excluded because in some of them there was no post-operative refractive data available in 56 patients. Pediatric ophthalmology care was given outside the Medical College of Wisconsin, or there was surgical undercorrection. There was ptosis of other etiology like trauma, myasthenia gravis, or eyelid mass, and some had conditions that precluded refraction like enophthalmia or microphthalmia. So 56 patients were included in the study. 15 had bilateral involvement, which gave a total of 71 ptotic eyes. Unilateral cases, the non-operative eye was used as an age-matched control. The data that was collected was the demographic profile, affected eye, refractive error, alignment, and amblyopia status. All these surgeries were done by oculoplasty surgeon at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and refractions were done by pediatric ophthalmologists at the same hospital. The data was analyzed using GraphPath Prism 7.04 software. Descriptive statistics were used to describe the demographics and the baseline clinical characteristics. Comparison between groups were performed using the unpaired t-test, and the preoperative and the post-operative data were compared amongst groups using the paired t-test. So the study had a total of 56 patients. All 112 eyes were analyzed. As already mentioned, there were 15 bilateral cases, so there were total 71 ptotic eyes and 41 control eyes. So coming to the results, the average age of the patients at presentation to pediatric ophthalmology was 2.7 years. The average age at the time of surgery was 5.1 years, and the average time between surgery and final refraction was 34 months. The average total follow-up was 66 months. So coming to the various surgeries, procedures that were undertaken, it was noted that frontalis-sting was the most commonly performed procedure in 48 eyes, approximately 68% of the patients. Also, the Asian population was 6 patients in this study. So 32 of 56 patients had strabismus, amblyopia, and or anisometropia. On comparing the baseline average spherical equivalent between the ptotic eyes and control eyes, there was no statistical significant difference. Astigmatism was defined as any amount of cylinder which was present in 42 of ptotic eyes and 17 of control eyes. And the average magnitude of astigmatism difference between the ptotic eyes and the control eyes was statistically significant. On comparing the preoperative and postoperative refractive data, the only aspect which was noted to be statistically significant was cylinder in ptotic eyes with an increase of 0.40 diopters. There was no association found between the amount of preoperative ptosis of the surgery performed and the amount of postoperative refractive change. The refractive changes then were further divided into it was separated age-wise. So the only aspect which was noted to be statistically significant was the increase in the cylinder of 0.61 diopter in the ptotic eyes of the patient more than 4 years. The rest all parameters were statistically non-significant. So also in comparison the number of patients having preoperative and postoperative astigmatism, there was a statistical significant difference, but there was no statistical significant difference with respect to the amount, the type of astigmatism in the ptotic eyes. Also, the number of patients showing amblyopia and anisometria pre-op and post-operative, there was no statistical significant difference. So, surgical correction of ptosis to treat or prevent anisometropic amblyopia is based on the assumption that astigmatism is induced by the mechanical forces exerted by the ptotic eyelid, which is similar to a large chalazion or hemangioma. Lifting of the ptotic eyelid is likely to alleviate this mechanical force and correct the astigmatism. But in reality, actually, the various studies, retrospective studies that have been done, like Miriam et al. Have shown that instead of actual decrease in the astigmatism, 10 patients showed increase in astigmatism. Also, this was supported by Kedera et al., which showed that the operative group showed increase in the cylinder of 0.3 diopters. Klimek et al., Paik et al. Paik et al. Showed that there was an increase in the oblique astigmatism. This is important because oblique astigmatism is more difficult to treat than the regular with the rule or the without the against the rule astigmatism. And the current study also showed an increase in the cylinder, which was statistically significant. Kedera et al. Also divided their analysis into 2 age groups. So they showed that in less than 4 years, there was decrease in the cylinder, and more than 4 years, there was an increase in the cylinder. And they use this data to advocate that surgery should be done at a younger age in patients with marked astigmatism. But a point to be noted is that their results were not clinically significant. And the authors in this study have in fact concluded that in age less than 4 years, decrease in cylinder, there's an increase in the cylinder, which they have not found it to be statistically significant, but there's a reverse to what the previous study has shown. So there are several other studies in literature which show there is either no change or only transient change to refractive error. They have also looked at the test showing the structure of cornea, if there's any change or any lasting effects, and they've shown that ptosis surgery has no lasting effects on the shape of cornea. So anisometropia and amblyopia persist in many patients post-operatively and may even develop anew in others. Hence, it is also important to emphasize on the parents who may just assume that all their child's vision concerns have been addressed by a successful ptosis surgery. So the authors also analyzed why they were excluded, the number of patients excluded in various studies, and they noted that approximately 25 to 30 to as high as 70 patients were excluded from various studies because there was no post-op refractive data available. So this emphasizes the importance of counseling for a refractive follow-up. So the authors conclude that there is either a worsening of astigmatism or no significant change in refractive error in operated eyes. Prior to surgery and after surgery, the risk of anisometropic amblyopia remains the same. It is thus best to have surgery later in life when they can better participate in examination and possibly have a lower risk of anesthesia-related complications. And it is also important to stress on the pediatric ophthalmology or a refractive follow-up to avoid treatable vision loss from amblyopia. The authors have mentioned the limitations of their study as that this is a retrospective chart review and it comes with its inherent limitations. So coming to the second part of the article, where we'll be dissecting the article based on each of the following, based on the MARI format. So coming to the methods, the study question is well defined, but there is a mismatch between the title of the study and the objective and the data. In the title, they have mentioned that presence of anisometropia, but they have not defined the anisometropia in the study. Also, they have not separately analyzed the patients which had an isometropia. And if you see the baseline characteristics, there was no statistical significant difference between the totic eyes and the control eyes in with respect to the refraction. Sample size is not adequately justified, but this being a retrospective study and it's probably a relatively uncommon condition, so that's okay. Study population has been, the inclusion and exclusion criteria has been well defined. Study period is well defined, and as mentioned, this is a retrospective chart review. So the control selected, probably evaluation of the undercorrected patients would have been better to actually note the effect of the ptotic eyelid on the refractive status of the patient, or evaluation of ptotic eyes of patients who have not undergone correction surgery would serve the purpose better. And patients with only anisometry and amblyopia have not been analyzed with respect to the post-operative changes. Coming to the assessment, the time of refraction which was used during the analysis was not standardized and not mentioned in the study, that at what particular refraction they have included for analysis in the study. Indication for the surgical procedure has also been not mentioned, because every surgical procedure has its own indication based on the levator action, the amount of ptosis, and also the age at which each surgical procedure was undertaken was not mentioned. Anesthesia complications, exposure characteristic to corneal issue, if any, has not been mentioned or analyzed. And also they have mentioned that probably when the child is older, the accuracy of surgical correction is better, but this has not been compared between the two age groups. This would have been a good point to compare to actually give the outcome. Statistical tests are very appropriate. So they have used a TE test. Assuming there's a normal distribution over such a wide range of age group, I would request the statistical experts to type in their comments regarding the statistical tests used in their study. Coming to the interpretation, the study reports on the largest number of eyes with complete preoperative and postoperative refractive data. There is worsening of astigmatism or no significant change in refractive error in the operated eyes. And anisometropic amblyopia, they have mentioned, is not a sole indication for surgery, but they have actually not talked about any anisometropic amblyopia per se. So what I extrapolate from this study is refractive error or astigmatism does not significantly change or improve by ptosis correction surgery. It is important to counsel pediatric patients, the parents regarding the pediatric or the refraction follow-up post-op. My interpretation is that visual axis covered is an absolute indication for early correction of ptosis surgery in order to avoid deprivation of amblyopia. Development of astigmatism or anisometria over follow-up probably may be a more important indication for correction. The risk, benefit, and expectations from correction should be clearly counseled to the parents, and it's important to emphasize or counsel for regular follow-up for refraction. So with this, I conclude my presentation, and we can have all the moderators unmuted probably.
Thank you for excellent presentation. So can we have the moderators unmuted? Swapnesh, have they been unmuted? So can we have Dr. Rishikesh Talwarkar? Rishikesh, could you give us insight into this article? What do you interpret from this article, and what do you do in your clinical practice? Rishikesh?
Yeah. I'm assuming that everybody can hear me. So
yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. So basically, I agree with what the presenter has said regarding the merits and demerits of this article. And first of all, most of the oculoplastic surgeons would definitely be, whenever they are looking at a small means child like who is less than 2 or 3 years of age and presenting with ptosis, the first and foremost they are looking at whether there is amblyopia which is potentially to develop due to covering of the visual axis. And at this time in age, it is very difficult, so to say, to assess the visual function accurately. as per this study goes, again, you can see that they have not mentioned how they have assessed the visual function of the children, like what type of method was used. Their mean age of presentation was 2.7 years, and whether they use subjective tests or whether they only use objective tests, that is not mentioned. As far as my practice goes, I am mostly doing early ptosis surgery only in those patients who have significant covering of the visual axis and therefore high risk of developing amblyopia due to stimulus deprivation.
I think the same comment has been given by Dr. Akshay Nair also, that stimulus deprivation amblyopia would be a confounder here. Siddharth, what is your opinion as a pediatric ophthalmologist?
When I went through the article,
can you speak a little loud, Siddharth? We can't hear you.
Now am I audible?
Yeah, but still a little soft.
Yeah.
Okay, so I limit my comments to the article in question. Basically, they are trying to find if ptosis surgery changes the progression of refraction in any way as compared to the better eye. Confounding factors here are they have not mentioned at what period of time this refraction has been checked. That means there are children who have had 18 months follow-up and there are children who have had a very long follow-up, like 5 and 6 years also. So we don't know whether maybe initially it doesn't have much of a change, but then later on, maybe after 2 years or 3 years, it does change the way the refraction progresses. So it would have been nice if they would have given a particular cutoff at which this particular refraction is taken. You know, suppose they should have had a minimum follow-up, say 3 years, and see what the amount of change is. The second thing I feel is most of these studies in which you have compared also, and in this study also, post-op refraction is missing in so many patients. That means even parents are not really worried about amblyopia and isometropia, and nor are the doctors probably counseling them regarding it. And that's why they don't turn up for even refraction. And that is a very disturbing thing, because then indirectly it tells you that the number one indication of ptosis surgery remains cosmetic, even in small children. The moment the child starts looking normal, parents are not bothered about anything else. And that is the reason why you will see that even in small children who are 2 years, 3 years, parents come and they really insist on getting operated rather than waiting. Even if you give them 10 reasons why they should wait, they will initially say yes to you and then probably come back after a month or so and say again, you know, we want this to be corrected. And if you are not obliging, they will go to somebody else who will correct it. So indirectly, I would say that cosmesis it remains the number one motivation for parents to undergo any kind of ptosis surgery, for that matter, even squint surgery. Lastly, I would like to say that these children who don't go under, like in this study also, they have excluded 19 children who were undercorrected after ptosis surgery. Now that would have been a very interesting way of looking at children who don't undergo surgery also. Like an undercorrected child is almost as good as a child who has not undergone surgery, because they have defined undercorrection as somebody who was having a residual refraction of a residual ptosis of 2 millimeter or less. So if you would have looked at that 19 people, then you would have said, does it actually, you have not found statistical significance, but at least you could have compared the eyes which have undergone surgery with the eyes which have undergone surgery but have, remained undercorrected largely. That would have been a very interesting data point to compare this. But as per this study and the comparative studies, I still feel that the number one indication for ptosis surgery, at least in the parent's mind, is cosmetic, and they will go to any extent to get it done.
Swarna, thank you, Siddharth. Swarna, the second question Vipul has put up, the earliest age at which you would have operated a case of congenital ptosis, and for what indication would you do? Any special caveats while pre-op assessment, intra-op, or a post-op care?
Good morning, everybody. I hope I'm audible.
Yes,
yeah,
please.
you are audible.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So the youngest age that I would have operated would be around maybe around 8 to 9 months of age. But the first and foremost criteria in this early age group would be a definite visual access coverage, which would be causing a form deprivation and amblyopia. So that would be my foremost concern. As to the second question that you asked about what is the pre-op assessment? Usually in these age group, it is very difficult to have a definitive assessment, and most of the patients I would be operating would be for this reason. So I would definitely look for the Bell's reaction as to how it is, and if there is any lag of thymus. I usually ask the parents to give me a picture of the child when he or she is sleeping, which would give a better idea, because the child might not have been very cooperative during the clinic visits.
Nupur, can you stop sharing your slides
Yes.
so that we can see the
Yeah.
speakers? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, Swarna, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Anything more that you want to add? Yeah, go ahead.
You're asking me.
Yeah, go ahead if you have
Okay.
anything. Yeah, more.
That's all I would be doing in the pre-op. For somewhere around 3 to 4 years of age, it is more easier to do an assessment. But what I would really advise the parents and tell them to keep in their minds that we might not achieve a full correction for the child even after a complete assessment. So parents are always counseled that there might be a post-operative residual ptosis, and definitely follow-up refractions are needed, which this article and many other articles emphasize. Although there might not be, all of them might not be on the same page as to what the refractive status is, but definitely there is some change in the refraction. There are, like this present article states, that there is a permanent, there could be a permanent residual increase in refraction. So the parents need to be counseled more, because they are, like Dr. Siddharth mentioned, that most of the parents lose to follow up. They don't give that much of importance to the ptosis. I mean, they give only importance to the cosmesis part of the ptosis and not to the other visual part. So I think that is more important.
Thank you. I think we have Dr. Sabyasachi and Dr. Maninder connected. So, Dr. Sabyasachi, you have written a lot of comments in the chat box. So, could you please just elaborate on the statistical part of the article?
Yeah, very good morning to everyone.
Yeah.
A couple of points before going to the statistical thing is that, what about the type of ptosis? I mean, what about the measurements of the ptosis, the LPS action? That is at all not been, elucidated upon. So I think it's vitally important to understand the severity of the ptosis in these cases. Then the second thing that the authors mention, even that the premise of the study is that the anisometropia is frequently cited as an indication for early intervention. Is that true? I mean, I don't really think that is true, from at least from all the, I'm not a squint specialist, of course, but from all the comments that are coming in so far, I don't think anisometropia is a frequently cited indication for early intervention. So the premise of the study is, to start with, is a bit surprising. Then authors could actually have mentioned, or I mean, how this article could really have contributed to literature is, if they could mention serial change in refraction. So what happened at first year, what happened at second year, or what happened at third year. So over a period of time, does this refraction change? So that may actually have, given us a better idea of how things are going. Then coming to the statistical part, of course, the methodology, they have not at all provided information on how that refraction was done. Was it an auto refraction? Was it an atropine refraction? Exactly how it was done, whether a subjective test was done or it was just objective. So I think some of those are large lacuna, which which have actually passed through the sieve of the reviewers. And they have also not mentioned, like I said, anything about ptosis measurement. Then standard deviations for age, refractive errors, and a lot of these other continuous variables are missing. which is a bit annoying because you can't really understand, what is the 95% interval, or what is the sort of the spread of all these. Then control eyes suddenly appear out of nowhere. We are not exactly sure how these control eyes behaved over a period of time again. So I don't think this control eyes really make a lot of difference here. So, and the last thing I wanted to mention about statistical concept is that this 4 year is taken as a 4 years before and after 4 years is taken as an arbitrary cutoff time point. So why has that been done is not exactly sure. Maybe they wanted to compare it with some previous study, but arbitrarily comparing before and after a certain time point has to be justified, which authors have not done. So I mean, overall, I think there are too many lacuna in this paper to take any meaningful information for our practices.
Thank you, Dr. Sengupta. So, Prerna, are you around? Yeah. So,
yeah, I'm there.
There are some questions which have been raised by Dr. Sengupta. So, what about the ptosis measurement in this
Perfect.
and the LPS action? So, could you just elaborate on that?
Yeah. Sure. So, firstly, I'd like to congratulate. It was Nupur. It was a nice presentation, and the discussion has been very relevant. Two things I think definitely it's come across as they have taken only astigmatism, which they've not mentioned whether it's collated or it's over a period of time. How the ptosis surgery can change it is probably the more severe the ptosis, the tighter the sutures, the vector forces of the eyelid change. So that can definitely be a factor that can affect the astigmatism based on the ptosis severity. And one thing Dr. Siddharth mentioned was that probably the undercorrected eyes are as good as not operated is again not true, because the vector forces of the eyelid do change, but they should have looked at that. And I think the 4 years age is not so arbitrary. It's more so because ease of examining the kids. So under 4 years, it's a little more difficult to assess the lag of thalamus or the forceful closure of the eyes or the orbicularis action, versus over 4 years where maybe the visual acuity, refraction, as well as these commands that they would obey would be much easier to do. So I am assuming the 4-year cutoff is due to that.
Thank you, Prerna. Maninder, are you around? Yeah, so could you give your comments on the article?
Dr. Parul, he has not mentioned his MSS. He has not typed his name fully.
Probably it must be Maninder only, Maninder Singh Setia. Yeah.
Yeah.
So is he around?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Maninder, please. Yeah.
Okay, so I discussed this case a little bit with Rishikesh. If Rishikesh can also join in, it would be nice, Asikarike.
Yeah, okay.
So we discussed this a bit yesterday. So I think what they have done is they've tried to do some controlled eye, and they've shown that there also the spherical equivalent has changed, and in the ptosis eye also the spherical equivalent has changed, and they just compared the means after a certain time, right? So what we discussed, that maybe they could have gone ahead and done some sort of statistical analysis that if the surgery would not have been done, what would have been the change, and then how much change can be attributed to the surgery, right? So right now, just compare, like in these kind of things, when you're actually saying that some intervention has worked or not worked, you actually have to go ahead and say what is attributed to this intervention. So those kind of things could have been done and explored further. And then yesterday we were discussing something about the spherical equivalent also. Maybe Rishi would be better to explain that.
Basically, as everyone is aware, that spherical equivalent will take into account both the spherical and cylindrical error. And as we know that ptosis generally has no role to play over the spherical error in any patient, which will be more due to axial reasons. And there would be a normal progression of the refraction in spherical errors. And cylindrical error is contributing only half again to the spherical equivalent. And ptosis is majorly contributing to the astigmatism because of the presumed pressure of the eyelid on the cornea. So therefore, if only cylinder would have been taken into account, only the astigmatism part of it was taken into account to see how is the change in the astigmatic refraction part, that would have been a much better indicator. Also, second thing is that what they have seen is only that the astigmatism increases in patients who undergo ptosis surgery. But whereas control eyes who have not got ptosis or they haven't been operated, how would they be used for comparison is a little difficult to analyze.
Yeah. Thank you.
May I ask one question?
Yeah.
So to all these statisticians, Dr. Siddharth, Dr. Maninder, and Dr. Sengupta and Dr. Rishikesh, so you all have mentioned that the control, probably the selection was not right. But whatever previous studies have been reported in literature, the control group has been this: unoperated, non-ptotic eyes in unilateral cases.
Yeah. So one sec. So first, Mukul, I'm not a statistician. I'm not a theoretical statistician. So no, because I'm not trained as a statistician. So it's okay. So the thing is, the control eyes can be what it is there. But as Rishi said, that if you take the spherical equivalent, then the outcome is heavy in favor of the spherical error and not in of the cylinder. So there you are hiding a lot of information. See, this is how statistics is used to hide information, right? So if you don't have a good answer, you can just use this. So maybe if we could have just looked at cylinder. And the other thing, what maybe, see, now we can move forward and do, yes, you can use the same control eye. You calculate the rate of progression of either the spherical equivalent or cylinder in the control eye where there is no ptosis, and it is the natural rate of progression. Since in 6 months, this is the progression, I would expect a similar progression in the ptosis eye. If that is not the case, how much else has the ptosis eye progressed, or how much have I prevented because of the ptosis? That kind of a preventable fraction or an attributable fraction, I think we should move ahead, move forward in that direction now, rather than just comparing means at the end of 6 months and then saying that our intervention was fine. There is a natural rate of progression. The same natural rate can be applied to the ptosis eye, and the progression of the ptosis eye can be estimated. Now, is the estimated progression similar to the actual progression? If not, we've been successful. Something to that effect.
Which they have typed. In the meanwhile, Anand can start, sharing his presentation. So, Rohit and Siddharth, please come.
Yeah. Hi. Am I audible?
Yeah, Rohit, you're audible.
Yeah. So just wanted to make one comment that a sample size calculation, if done, at the beginning of the study, it makes a big difference. Though we know that it was an uncommon condition which was studied. And second thing is about the t-test. Looking at the standard deviations, some of the standard deviations were more than 1/3 of the mean. This is an indirect. It indirectly suggests that the data may be non-parametric, especially if the sample size is small. So in these cases, a non-parametric test would have been appropriate.
Thank you. Siddharth, you had some comment. Yeah.
No, my comment was just an extension of what I already said, that even though you might conclude that anisometropia cannot be an indication for doing a ptosis surgery, I would still consider refraction as a very important determinant before and after surgery, and to document it properly so that you can yourself see the difference. In this case, it has been diluted by so many factors that I don't think you can go by the statistical insignificance of the difference that was found, because the sample itself is very heterogeneous.
Yeah, thank you. So I think with this, we will move on to the next article. Dr. Anand?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Parul ma'am, for giving me this opportunity. So the topic for the second journal club today is the characteristics and factors associated with intraocular lens tilt and decentration after cataract surgery. A short intro. With the process of surgical technique and intraocular lenses designed nowadays, cataract surgery aims to yield high-quality visual performance. Numerous studies have reported that IOL decentration greater than 0.4 mm and tilt greater than 5 degrees induce wavefront aberrations that lower visual performance. Astigmatism, defocus, and coma can be affected by IOL decentration and tilt, especially for toric and as well as multifocal lenses and as well as aspheric IOLs. Instruments which we generally use to measure the IOL tilt and decentration are skim flick photography, Purkinje images, and KCR2. KCR2 has been used in this study. The KCR2, the advantages of KCR2 is it's a second generation anterior segment OCT with a wavelength of 1310 nanometers. It has a faster scanning speed, deeper scanning depth, high repeatability, higher resolution, thus allowing clear imaging of the crystalline lens and IOLs. And hence it can measure the IOL tilt and decentration in reference to the corneal topographic axis. What was known before conducting this study was the anterior segment OCT, that is the KCR2 device, can provide a three-dimensional analysis of the IOL tilt and decentration with high repeatability. Also, the IOL decentration and tilt are associated with preoperative crystalline length and the axial length. Several studies have reported preoperatively the crystalline length, axial length, capsular tomy sizes, IOL type effects on the IOL decentration and tilt. The magnitude and direction of preoperative crystalline lens tilt have been proved to be strongly correlated with the postoperative tilt. The tilt of the crystalline lens could help predict the postoperative IOL tilt. Moreover, axial length elongation and severely malformed capsular axis were confined to positively correlate with the IOL decentration. For the IOL design, one-piece, three-piece IOLs have been confined to perform equally well in terms of decentration, tilt, visual acuity, and total aberration. However, the influence of other potential factors such as the lens thickness, IOL material, diabetes, and previous pars plana vitrectomy are unknown. So the purpose of this study was to analyze the characteristics, systemic and ocular factors which are all associated with IOL tilt and decentration after an eventful phacoemulsification. The study was performed in Guangzhou, China, and it's a cross-sectional study. The population included 196 eyes of 196 patients. Study period being April and May 2019. We had people had this ethics approval. The exclusion criteria which was there was eye disease that might affect the function of the lens suspensory ligament, such as any previous ocular trauma, any subluxation, any pseudo-exfoliation, or RPE degeneration, intraoperative complication during the surgery, poorly dilating pupils which affects the capsular axis, high myopia, that is axial length of more than 26 millimeters, and patients with any fundal disease or glaucoma. Study procedures, all the patients underwent the examination, the routine examination. Non-mediatic as well as mediatic photographs both were taken before and after the surgery, 3 months after the surgery. The lens thickness, axial length, anterior chamber depth were measured by IOL master. The cortical and nucleus opacity were evaluated by comparing the lens digital photographs with standard LOCS3, nuclear opalescence, and nuclear color. Two ophthalmologists graded each eye independently, and the mean of the two values were used for analysis. All the patients received all the patients received standard phacoemulsification and in the bag IOL implantation. All the IOLs were aligned at 90 degrees. Of the 196 patients, 145 received a one-piece squarish hydrophobic lens, 46 received one-piece hydrophilic lens, and 5 lenses received a three-piece hydrophobic IOL. Due to this, since the three-piece IOL were very small, they were incorporated with the one-piece hydrophobic IOL for the analysis. Capsular axis IOL overlap evaluated with digital retroillumination images taken at the IOL optical surface after pupil dilatation. and was graded as 360 degrees, 180 to 360 degree, and less than 180 degree overlap. Two ophthalmologists graded each patient's image independently, and since to avoid any controversial, it was when there was any controversial, it was reassessed by a senior ophthalmologist. The anterior segment OCT examination was done to measure the tilt and decentration. Generates 8 distinct anterior segment images from 8 different angles, and a 3D analysis was given for the same. Normally, the software recognizes and generates the IOL outline. The IOL marks were rechecked and manually adjusted to ensure the accuracy of the measurements. This is a photograph showing the IOL tilt and decentration using the KCR2 anterior segment OCT. The yellow axis, I think this is the one, and the corneal vertex axis are automatically shown by the inbuilt software. Data from each eye was taken. For patients who had binocular surgery, the eye which was closer to 3 months was chosen. Tilt and decentration under non-mydriatic and mydriatic conditions were compared using the PAIR-T test. The correlation of IOL tilt and decentration with ocular biometric and systemic parameters and visual acuity were determined using univariate as well as multivariate linear regression analysis. Results. 196 patients of 196 eyes of 196 patients were chosen, which included 83 men and 113 females. The patients ranged from 26 to 91 years. The mean age was 66. The mean lens thickness was 3.52 millimeters, and the mean axial length was 24.5 millimeters. This is the demographic data showing the mean age, the sex ratio, and the comorbid condition like diabetes, hypertension, any previous PPV. The mean IOL tilt was 4.86 degrees from the corneal topographic axis under non-mydriatic conditions and 4.89 under mydriatic conditions. The decentration was 0.2 millimeters and 0.21 and 0.2 millimeters under non-mydriatic and mydriatic conditions. So as you can see, there was no statistical difference in the tilt and decentration between mydriatic and non-mydriatic eyes. 21 eyes, however, had a tilt of more than 7 degrees as well as a decentration of more than 0.4 mm. 50% with both tilt less than 5 degrees and decentration point of less than 0.2 mm after cataract surgery. On mydriatic eyes. This is a histogram. This demonstrates the tendency of the IOL tilt towards the inferotemporal direction in both the eyes, as well as the it also shows that the IOLs are more likely to decenter towards each quadrant. The univariate and the multivariate analysis of the IOL with other ocular parameters with respect to age, the sex distribution, as well as IOL should be cautious in these patients. In multivariate analysis, the greater IOL centration was significantly associated with axial length, lens thickness, and the classification of capsulorhexis IOL overlap. Of the 21 patients with decentration of more than 0.4 mm, 5 had a longer axial length, more than 26 millimeter. 5 had overlarge capsulorhexis with less than 180 degree IOL overlap, and 7 had lens thickness of more than 5 mm. So longer axial length thicker lens, larger capsular axis. They are more likely to result in more IOL decentration. Age, gender, diabetes, hypertension, and IOL material, they were not significantly associated with tilt and decentration. This is a univariate and multivariate analysis. The mean best corrected visual acuity of the patient, they did not seem to directly correlate with the tilt and decentration after being adjusted for age, gender, diabetes, and hypertension. Discussion. IOL tilt and decentration, these induces wavefront aberrations and thus may affect the visual function. A central IOL is thus required for proper visual function. Previous studies showed the average IOL tilt ranging from 2 to 6 degrees. In the study which we are presenting, the IOL tilt was about 4.8 degrees, which is well within the range of the previous studies. KCR2 can also be used to measure the tilt and decentration of IOLs with good repeatability, which is very important, which was also reported by Kimura et al. Corneal vertex is a better reference to assess the tilt and decentration because it is not affected by pupil shape and a center. This study has a greater decentration as compared to the results by Kimura et al. The reason being, they had enrolled patients with longer axial length. IOLs are also likely to shift in a larger capsular bag as the lens capsular bag loosens with elongation of axial length. According to some studies, the axial length is positively correlated with IOL decentration. What is the effect of the axial length on IOL tilt? The axial length ranged from 22 to 32, with the mean of being about 23 in the study by Kimura et al., which means the larger decentration found in this study because we had an axial length of around, mean axial length of around 24. IOLs are more prone to tilt in patients with shorter axial lengths. Another study confirmed the same. The explanation being the lens is likely to be tilt in a crowded intraocular space. Also, post-operative IOL tilt is strongly correlated with pre-operative crystalline lens tilt. What is the effect of capsular axis? According to this study and the study by Fend et al., capsular axis size and shape had little effect on the IOL capsular bag performance. Exceptions being eyes with severely malformed capsular axis, larger capsular axis size with bad IOL coverage. The explanation for this being the study focused on the eccentric and small capsular axis, while more patients with large capsular axis size were included in this study. In this study, 64% of the patients had eyes with incomplete overlap of capsular axis and IOL, of which 17% eyes had less than half of the IOL edge covered because of the large capsular axis size, less than 180 degree of overlap. Several studies have reported that the one-piece and three-piece hydrophobic IOLs, they show excellent positional stability in the capsular bag with no difference in the IOL tilt or decentration. The study as well as other studies demonstrated that hydrophobic and hydrophilic had similar performance in terms of axial stability, decentration and tilt. Effect of VR surgery. This has been reported that the silicone oil and gas intravitreal tamponades might induce post-operative tilt and decentration of one-piece IOLs when combined with phacoemulsification. Leisure et al. Found that the air tamponade does not induce significant more IOL tilt or decentration compared with the BSS. In this study, prior PPV was associated with a greater IOL tilt but was not correlated to the IOL decentration. We speculate that the IOLs are more prone to shift in patients without the support of vitreous. Limitations of this study, it's a cross-sectional study. The correlation between the preoperative tilt and decentration and the postoperative tilt and decentration is unknown. Also, the influence of IOL tilt and decentration on higher order aberrations such as astigmatism and coma still needs research. Also, the sample size was too small. Larger prospective study is thus necessary. To conclude, the IOL tilt and decentration can be measured automatically, efficiently using a second generation anterior segment OCT Otherwise, that is the case here too. No financial interest in this. PPV history as well as a shorter axial length were associated with a greater IOL tilt, while longer axial length, thicker lens, and large capsular axis contributed to decentration. Implantation of toric multifocal IOLs in these patients should be cautious. An appropriate capsular exercise that covers the IOL edge perfectly should be warranted in cataract patients, especially in patients with hypermyopia or thicker lens. To assess in the MARI format, the study questions, I think it's well defined. That is the prevalence of IOL tilt and decentration with regards to the all the other factors. Sample size was adequate, but since it's an observational study, it won't be that significant. But for a larger perspective, we should require a larger sample size. Study population, the inclusion as well as the exclusion criteria were well defined. Study period was also well defined, since it's a cross-sectional observational and interventional study. It was an observational study subjected to the KCR2, that is the OCT. IOL tilt and decentration were assessed in reference to the topographic axis, not in the visual axis. Univariate and multivariate analysis of compounding factors like age, axial length, vitrectomized capsular axis, IOL overlap, etc. Both univariate and multivariate analysis were used. Tilt of less than 7 degrees and decentrations of more than 0.4 mm were seen in around 88% of the eyes. 10 to 12% had more than 7% tilt as well as more than 0.4 mm of decentration. Low risk groups basically had undergoing cataract surgery because we should have excluded the eyes with previous vitrectomies. Shorter axial length than previous vitrectomized eyes with higher tilt. Longer axial length, inadequate capsular axis or IOL overlap had a more IOL decentration. IOL tilt and decentration insignificant in eyes with normal axial length, adequate capsular axis, and IOL overlap, and without previous vitreous surgery. Themes of axial length is associated with higher tilt and decentration. Is important, especially with aspheric IOLs, toric, and as well as multifocal IOLs. With this, I conclude my presentation.
Dr. Parul, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so thank you, Anand, for a nice presentation. Now, do we have Dr. Vavikar here? Dr. Vavikar, could we have your comments on the article and your experience with the tilt and decentration in terms of, in reference to the aspheric and the premium intraocular lenses?
Good morning, everybody. I hope I am audible.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. You're audible.
First of all, Dr. Anand, excellent presentation.
Thank you so much, sir.
So we talk about the article now. It's a very good article, but as usual, there are going to be some limitations. First of all, there is no mention of how they have come to this sample size. With so many variables to be studied, I think the sample size could have been more, but statisticians will throw more light on this. Then visual acuity is hardly a indicator of such a fine aspect of the cataract surgery as tilt and decentration. Instead of visual acuity, they could have studied either the induced astigmatism, total hiatal aberrations, MTF, modular transverse function, or point spread function. Detailed information about the CCC overlap, the size of the CCC, and the whether there is any correlation between the quadrant where the CCC has gone out and decentration in that direction should have been done. Only saying that CCC was not overlapping in so many cases is not adequate. If I remember right, 17% of the patient had CCC which was going out, and that is
4%.
that is a too high a percentage in today's cataract surgery. I think all of us are doing much better than that. Then single piece and three piece hydrophobic lenses need to be compared separately. We all know that three piece IOL is far more stable, so we tend to put it in the high myopic patients. And whether they, what is the difference between these two designs as far as the decentration and tilt is concerned need to be established. There is a mention of association between the pre-op tilt and post-op tilt, but what is the correlation? That has not been done. All the data was there. It was just a matter of applying a test, and we could have come out with a one nice maybe secondary outcome of the test. So that's all.
Thank you, Dr. Varikar. Dr. Sandeep Narwekar. Sir, do you have any comment on the article? And another question is that so far the decentration and tilts have been measured in reference to the pupillary axis. Now, this Asia 2 machine, I think, measures in reference to the corneal topographic axis. So, any comment on that too? Yeah.
Sure. Well, there are lots of issues with this article. I absolutely agree with Dr. Varikar with most of the things that he has said. Now, to come to the second point first, regarding the tilt between what they are looking at, tilt is measured as the angle between the corneal topographic axis, which is almost akin to the visual axis, and the IOL axis, which is basically a perpendicular to the IOL segment plane. And I think that this is the right way to go about it. It is not correct to go according to the pupillary axis, because the pupillary axis is the midpoint of the pupil and the line which has a perpendicular to the cornea. Obviously, the pupillary axis does not go to the fovea, whereas the corneal topographic axis will be landing on the fovea. Obviously, all your aspheric IOLs will have to be centered on this point rather than that. So I think this is a way forward. We should, in all future studies, take the corneal topographic axis as the axis to measure tilt. And as these study and various other studies have shown, there are other studies also, and Dr. Anand may be well aware that there are other studies which show that the corneal topographic axis is the axis to go for measurement of lens tilt and not pupillary axis or the line of sight. So I think this is a way forward. What this study has especially shown that we now have a beautiful instrument like your KC2, which is a swept source OCT. It has got a good penetration. It's a fast repeating scan, and it has good penetration almost up to, I think, somewhere around 1.1 centimeters or 11 millimeters. So you are able to get even the back of the posterior capsule, and it automatically measures the lens decentration as well as tilt. So we don't have to really, like in the Scheimpflug days, we had to go and draw lines and maps to measure the axis. We don't need to do that. We don't need to do a calculation like a tan of a certain angle to find the amount of tilt now and the decentration. Now it is all automatic. So in that way, this is a good method to probably go in the future. But I'm sure various other anterior segment OCTs like the Antirion and the newer machines that are coming out can also do the same very well. Now, regarding the study, I found one of the basic things is they should have, since they already had the KC, they should have had a pre-operative measurement of the natural crystalline lens tilt. All along the study, they've only mentioned that it correlates well, but they never mentioned in this study during the methods that this important tool was actually exercised. It was never exercised. I mean, there are so many points I can't remember offhand, but like, for example, vision. Vision, as Dr. Varikar said, visual acuity on Snellen's chart is the least important parameter when you're doing a study with aspheric IOLs that have to be centered on the visual axis. To say that lens tilt will have no effect on the vision is also incorrect. All of us know that if you have a badly positioned lens, if your lens is badly tilted, like for example, in cases which have subluxated, or even in regular toric lenses, they do cause coma, And occasionally they may even cause diplopia, because even a toric lens is essentially a multifocal lens. So its orientation along the CTA is very important to get good vision. Now, as far as the capsular axis is concerned, I have the same views like Dr. Vavikar. I think all of us have probably now getting 95 or more % of lenses with a nice, good concentric overlap. So to find a study where more than 64% of the cases there was not a 360-degree overlap, means either 0 to 180 or 180 to 360, is not a fair way to know whether this lens or this particular material is concerned. I have one comment about the single piece and the three-piece lenses. Remember, the three-piece lenses are all angulated. The capsular contraction forces will have some effect. We know that, we all know that the three-piece lenses do not probably center as well as the single-piece lenses. In fact, that's the reason why it came about. Even the haptics can bend unequally because they have a different material as compared to the primary body of the lens. So I think basically it should be assessed in terms of single-piece lenses also. And of course, there are many other points which might probably come along as we talk. But these are the immediate things that came to mind. That there was this other thing about now the most important thing. These people concluded that the IOL tilt was seen more in shorter eyes. And what was the definition of shorter eyes in the study? 22.13 millimeters. I don't think 22.13 millimeters gets classified as a short eye. When you're talking of short eyes, we are talking of highly hyperopic eyes. These are with actual lens of 19, 20 and less than 21 millimeters of mercury. Yes, the sample size was a little flawed in the sense that there were more myopic in this as compared to previous studies. But I don't think 22.13 should be actually classified as a shorter eye. And many of the IOL pars which have actual lens of 22.12 are in almost the near emmetropic range. To conclude that shorter eyes, and therefore, well, theoretically it sounds very good that the shorter the eye, more the crowding, more the tilt. But whether it actually happens in all eyes with 22.12 millimeters, we don't know. Now, none of us usually use decentration and tilt. We are referring to an article, but as they said that maybe the tilt has not much role to play. Decentration, I agree. The lenses which are thicker preoperatively will have large floppy capsular bags. So more likely for decentration, with eyes that are longer, and so on and so forth. If certain other things come, I will definitely let you know.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nagarkar. I think it was a very good point that you highlighted that they had actually the numbers, okay? And they just had to look at the data, preoperative lens tilt and a decentration, because you could probably exclude the patients who had the same kind of decentration and tilt post-operatively.
Yes.
Because the patient had preoperative decentration. The second thing which I had a little missing is that whatever values that we are looking at, 0.2, 0.4 millimeter or a degree of tilt is in respect to the pupillary axis. And here they have taken topographic axis. And I did not find any study where they looked at the topographic axis, So whether the same values can be taken as, good enough to say that this is normal and this is abnormal, or, is something which I really was not very sure of.
Yeah, I think, Parul, I'll just probably interrupt you here. I think this is probably the first study which is comparing it with the corneal topographic axis. And if you go to see, it's probably the way to go.
Yeah, it's a beautiful article. I would no doubt rely on the findings, So do we have Dr. Vijay Shetty here?
Yeah.
Do you have any comments on this? And one more question is that we look at the capsular fibrosis as an ongoing event, and the study has only studied for the first 3 months. So do you see any, change in the decentration tilt?
Yeah.
And is it a way to prevent or treat the IOL tilt and decentration?
So it is very, the important point here was that the rhexis size was predominantly affecting the centration and not the tilt. Here I would expect both tilt and decentration to be affected by the rhexis size, especially when there is no overlap. And it also depends on whether the overlap is, how many degrees of non-overlap is there, plus in what orientation. In this study, the IOLs were oriented at 90 degrees. So if the overlap was not there on the nasal and temporal, it would have been more likely that it would decenter, it would tilt. And decentration, to the best of my understanding, should not be affected by the size of the rhexis or the non-overlap. And secondly, the tilt was more affected in shorter eye. And the shorter eye, we can understand that the tilt is more because of the crowding. But at the same time, the IOL power required in a shorter eye is much higher. So the effect of IOL tilt on the ocular aberration, especially the astigmatism due to oblique incidence and other higher order aberration, would be high. So since we did not have very short eyes, so it is difficult to interpret this. And moreover, the post-operative aberrometry like eye trace could have been done to understand how much of aberration is induced by the IOL tilt, or the correlation between the IOL tilt and the post-operative internal aberration. That would have helped us to understand. And so as I said, like the hypermetropic eye, which requires higher IOL power, is likely to affect the quality of vision rather than the normal eye. And with respect to anterior capsular phimosis, which might happen in future, so it was interesting to observe these eyes over 1 month, 3 months, and 1 year, to whether the tilt and the decentration would increase with time. And in such a case, it would be ideal to do an anterior capsular polishing if we are expecting high IOL tilt post-operatively, as in short eyeballs, or like something which induces anterior capsular phimosis like myopia and pseudo-exfoliation. Such cases, probably doing a anterior capsular polishing at the end of the surgery would help.
Thank you, Vijay. See, I have one more question, is that if, to all the moderators, if you have a patient who was undergone a cataract surgery and you see that patient did not have a preoperative corneal astigmatism, you don't have a lot of SIA induced, okay, and you still happen to see the patient having a induced cylinder. So probably you're expecting that this patient does have some amount of, can you hear me? Yes, some amount of tilt or a decentration. So could you do anything like a YAG capsulotomy? So would it really help in correcting the tilt, decentration, or we should not be attempting, or we should not be inferring that this patient has a tilt and decentration? So is there any method by which we could, in our clinical practice, since we don't have KCR2 machine, so can find out the tilt and the decentration, and probably take the interventional step to all the moderators, whoever wants to.
Yeah. See, I'm sorry. Previous studies have been done which says that the tilt induces an astigmatism of only 0.3 to 0.4 diopters. So that is not an important consideration. Perhaps what is more important is the amount of higher order aberrations, typically coma in a, if you have implanted a toric IOL, or if it is a spheric lens, then the amount of other higher order aberrations like a negative or positive spherical aberration as well as coma. Can we, if you don't mind, let others panelists also answer, but can we have the statistician coming in and talking about the sample size?
Yeah. So can we have Maninder and Sabyasachi? Are both of you all around? So anyone can answer. Swapnish, have you unmuted them?
Sabyasachi is unmuted, and Dr. Maninder also.
He's showing muted. Dr. Sengupta is showing muted.
If he wants to discuss it, yeah, let him discuss it and then I'll talk about it.
Yeah. Maninder, you can also go ahead, no problem.
This is that the outcome is linear. I would not worry much about this. I know, somehow in India we are obsessed with larger numbers, but larger numbers does not necessarily mean a good study. It does not necessarily mean a good study. So I don't know the estimation of the sample size, but if the outcome is linear, I'm comfortable. It's a linear outcome, right? You're looking at the it's a linear regression. I would not worry much. Yes, a priori sample size, but um, I'm I'm against using a blanket statement that the sample size was inadequate. When we comment so much on the authors that the sample size is inadequate, as a reviewer, why am I saying that the sample size is inadequate? Have I done any estimation to say that or just because the number looks small? I think we should get over this thing that a small number is a bad number.
I would like to also come in on this, if it's okay. Yes, actually, yes. So I completely agree with Maninder that the sample size in this kind of study is not it's not possibly essential. However, what is important when we are dealing with linear regression is outliers. How many extreme values there were. So they are called as influencers in statistical terms. So there may not be too many influencers looking at the means and standard deviations. So overall, this is quite an excellent study. And I usually don't say a lot of that for most studies, but then this is an excellent study. So I've just put in my comments. I'll just repeat them. So the larger elephant in this whole study is the eyes with PPV, because eyes with PPV had a 1.7 degree more tilt than others. So we call this a sensitivity analysis, where you can do this linear regression by excluding eyes with PPV, and that may be quite quite indicative of what the overall picture may be. And also we would like to see cutoffs for what is the degree of tilt at which it starts influencing vision significantly, or what is the cutoff of the axial length to see at what point it starts influencing tilt and decentration. Because if you see the shorter axial length is when axial length reduces, there is more tilt, and when it increases, there is more decentration. So extremes of axial length are probably not good, but what are these cutoffs? I think that is very important to get from this kind of a data, and that is done with something called a Yoden index. It's very relatively simple to do. So if we had a cutoff, say more than 25.5 and less than say 21.5, these are the eyes where you have a lot of decentration and a lot of tilt. That might have been helpful, but these cutoffs are not provided. So that might have been good from a study like this.
I think there was one. Well, actually, when they said index less than 26 of the axial length was included, and while giving the results,
Parul, your voice is cracking.
So I'm not very.
Okay, I think Dr. Parul has disconnected. Yeah.
She's reconnected, but she's muted.
She needs to be unmuted. Dr. Swapnish, can you unmute her, please?
Yeah, sure.
Running behind the time. So we have some question, I think some comment. Dr. Anaga has commented that they have not commented about zero aspheric lenses versus a negatively aspheric lenses. So I think Dr. Vavikar wanted to comment about the article per se after the citation. So Dr. Vavikar, are you around? Dr. Sandeep?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any comments, further comments? Okay, I will reframe the...
Yeah, no. Please repeat the question because we couldn't hear it very well. Yeah.
Initially, we said that, even I have forgotten the question. So I think we'll move forward to the next question is that when we look at an IOL fixation, most of us are doing it in the bag fixation. But there are certain premium lenses which are available for in the sulcus fixation. So what is the opinion of the panelist in terms of these lenses? Should we really implant, or we are going to expect a lot of tilt and decentration, and we should not be doing that? In sulcus
Ideally, I would like all premium lenses to be implanted only in the back. All premium IOL should be implanted only in the back for the most stable results.
There are
If I
some
heard
Sulcoflex which are available as a multifocal lenses.
Yeah,
So,
those are the add-on lenses, right?
yeah, add-on lenses. So, do you think that should be because that you are going to expect more of a tilt and decentration in the ciliary sulcus?
Right.
So, should we really?
No, I'm not much in favor of Sulcoflex lenses. I've used some Sulcoflex torics, which were rotating in the third axis, which is the anterior.
So it means
So I'm not very much in favor of that. No.
Dr. Vavikar?
Yes, I'm also not in favor of Sulcoflex lenses. We have tried them, and they don't give that great results as we expect. And there is a certain mismatch between our and patients' expectations and the results.
Nupur, are there any questions in the chat box?
Yeah, I think Dr. Swapnish has asked a question that is it because of vitrectomy, anterior and core vitrectomy, zonular damage in an enthusiastic anterior vitrectomy or a vitrectomy of the base? So, Dr. Swapnish, could you probably...
Yeah. It is related to comment which Sabyasachi made.
Yeah.
The variation in patients who have undergone PPV, possibly because of there is variation in the amount of vitrectomy which every surgeon does in every case in the anterior and the core vitrectomy, the amount of vitreous which is removed, and also in a over enthusiastic anterior vitrectomy or a vitreous base excision, there can be possibly zonular damage also. Sabyasachi, I think, already has commented. Could you just elaborate?
Yeah, so I think that is very true as to how much anterior vitrectomy is going to contribute to this. I think why vitrectomy causes this or does it really cause will be very clear if you look at the same, decentration and tilt when it is done in pseudophakic eyes. So when we have, the tilt and decentration before the vitrectomy and then after, say, 6 months after the vitrectomy, if there is significantly increasing tilt and decentration.
Also the tamponade.
Yes. Yes,
most
likely.
Parul, can I make
last
one
comment? Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah.
Parul, just one comment about, I think you were talking something about spherical and aspherical lenses. So aspherical lenses are more sensitive to decentration as compared to spherical lenses. Aspherical lenses are more sensitive to decentration as compared to spherical lenses.
Yeah, because there was a comment by Dr. Anagha, so if she wants to probably elaborate on her question, and even Dr. Rohit Modi, the last comments that we can take. So Anagha, are you around?
I'll unmute.
Unmute, yeah.
Probably it is the zero aspheric IOL which is immune to decentration, but it would still be for tilt, because the tilt probably depends only on the IOL power, the effect of the tilt, and decentration mostly affects whether it is a very high negative aspheric like Tecnis, which has minus 0.27. It will induce coma when it is decentered with respect to visual axis. Again, newer generation aspheric, which is like called bisign aspheric, or like the central positive spherical aberration and peripheral negative spherical aberration is said to perform better than the pure negative spherical aberration, because coma generated by the center is neutralized by the coma induced by the periphery.
The last, just one question. What is the clinical interpretation that we can take from this article as a cataract surgeon? So if I'm a cataract surgeon, what is of the utmost importance to me when I look at this article? Clinically relevant.
Yeah, clinically relevant points is that when the axial length is normal, just don't worry. But if the axial length is high and you're putting a high performance like a multifocal or a trifocal, we'll have to be very, very careful. And even aspheric lenses, we'll have to be very careful when we are thinking of putting it in a highly myopic or a highly hypermetropic eyes. Previous history of pars plana vitrectomy. Also, we have to be
capsular tension ring.
Capsular tension ring, enough studies have been done, and they have it's already gone. There was a long time back when even I have tried capsular tension ring with multifocal IOLs, but it did not seem to be having that great an effect. except maybe perhaps little decrease in the PCtomy rate. So that is now, I think that issue is more or less settled, that there is no need of CTR unless you are dealing with a really high myopia.
Anagha, Sandeep, Vijay, any comment on that? Yeah.
Can I say something? Yeah.
Yeah, Anagha.
Very
Yes,
good
yes.
morning. Very lovely discussion here. And actually, the comment that I wanted to make was basically, if it's a zero aspheric lens, then it is more forgiving. So if at all you feel that there is some kind of, CCC is not central, or you feel that it's not going to overlap equally on all the sides, or there is a doubt of a zonular dialysis in some way, then it is better not to put in a negative aspheric lens. Definitely, we have to be very cautious with the multifocal, but a zero aspheric lens in such cases should be the preferred lens of choice. Another thing is there has been no mention also about if there is any radial anterior capsular tears, even if the rhexis is proper, but if there has been an anterior capsular tear, then there could be a decentration later on with time. There has been no mention probably in this study about that.
They have not included them.
The exclusion criteria.
Yes, but they have only mentioned about the size and the overlap, I think.
No, they have excluded such cases.
They have excluded.
Excluded.
Intraoperative complications are excluded. So we presume that they have.
So this is a part of the complication, according.
Yeah. Dr.
Can I make a comment?
Any comment about the CTR in reference to the high myopic eyes for decentration tilt? Dr. Vijay?
Yeah, now see, remember one thing, that all high myopes normally have large capsular bags, and the thickness of the lens that you're going to put in is probably going to be thinner than even the regular lenses. So these lenses will be more prone to decentration. I think I would, as Dr. Bhavekar said, in high myopes, I would like to put a capsular tension ring. If nothing else, it helps to stabilize and center the lens better as compared to not putting a CTR. So CTR in high myopes is a yes for me. Yeah.
Dr. Bhavekar had some comment, I think.
I wanted to talk something regarding what the statistician said. Point number one, it's a very well taken point that sample size is adequate, because I am not an expert in that. But is it necessary that in the study you describe on what basis this sample size has been arrived at? And point number two is that Dr. Sengupta was talking about the cutoff regarding tilt and decentration. If he's talking historically, these figures are known. I think tilt of 0.5, more than 0.5, 5 degrees is significant. And if he is talking about this current study, it is not possible, because it is studied against the visual acuity, and visual acuity is hardly a parameter where you can assess the effect of these two points, the decentration and the tilt, which has been equally highlighted by all the three panelists.
Rohit, can you comment about Sir's question about the power of this thing? So how do you calculate? Rohit, I think that will be the last question, and then we will,
What Sir said, so I take it that when you do a prospective study, usually the sample size is estimated. But describing the sample size, calculation of the sample size is not necessarily a norm in most observational studies. Like most in randomized trials, usually they want you to show the estimation of the sample size. So I would presume that they would have done some sort of a calculation, since it's a prospective study. You have to tell the ethics committee why are you taking these people and this and that. But it, like in thesis you describe, but in papers it is generally, in the observational studies, it is generally not a norm to include your sample size estimation in detail in observational studies. And papers have been published without sample size estimation for observational studies for a long time now. I don't know if I'm the editor, I would ask for it. I would necessarily not ask for it. If there is no significance, I would say there's a power calculation. But because it's a linear, again, it's a linear outcome. Linear outcome, the change is very sensitive. Like a change of 1 to 1.1 is a change. So it's a pretty linear outcomes are, you're more flexible with linear outcomes.
Rohit, are you around?
Yeah. So I just wanted to add to what Dr. Maninder and Dr. Sabyasachi has said about sample size calculation. So to answer Dr. Vavika's question is, we need a primary endpoint measure, and considering a primary endpoint measure, we can either consider the tilt or the decentration as one of the primary endpoint measures and then calculate the sample size. So like Dr. Maninder said, that usually for observation studies, it's not a norm, but it's always welcome if the authors do show the sample size calculation, especially in their discussion. They have written that the sample size was small and a larger sample size would be better. That is one of the
for me, like just to interrupt for a minute, my professor used to say that's the most unwanted statement in a study. Like, you cannot end a study by saying that it's a small study and a better study is required. Right. It's like, so in epidemiology, that's like one of the most unwanted statements. If you knew a better study, if you knew this study is going to be small, why did you do it? Why didn't you do an adequate study to begin with?
Yeah. Dr. Sengupta, last comment, and then we'll conclude.
One quick last point is that it's not about how large a sample is, but how much variability there is in the outcome measure that you're trying to study. So here there is enough variability there, from 0 to 1.7 or 1.8 or even 2-3 degrees. There is a lot of variability here. So this study is enough to assess what the outcome measure was.
Yeah, so I think we've already overshooted the time. So I thank all the speakers, the moderators, and the delegates for attending this JC. Now, those of you who want to know about the further JC updates, we have a group on WhatsApp as JC group. We could probably forward a link on the BOA CME group, and those who want to join, because we are giving the first update on that group. Okay, so those you who want to really join that group, we will be forwarding a link. Join that group. So thank you, everyone. With this, we will conclude the meeting. That's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.